it's not on, it's not streaming, but.
Oh, I'll wait then.
Okay. There it goes.
Good evening, Shabbat Shalom. We open our prayer books to page 334. This is a new opening song for me, Doror Yikra.
O source of light and truth, creator of the eternal law of goodness, help us to find knowledge by which to live. Lead us to take the words we shall speak into our hearts and our lives. Bless all who enter the sanctuary of need, all who bring the offerings of their hearts. May our worship lead us to acts of kindness, peace, and love. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'hadlik ner shel Shabbat. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, sovereign of the universe, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to kindle the light of Shabbat. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'hadlik ner shel Shabbat.
Page 9, responsively. There are days when we seek things for ourselves and measure failure by what we do not gain. There are days when we exploit nature as if it were a horn of plenty that can never be exhausted. There are days when we act as if we cared nothing for the rights of others. So we embrace Shabbat, day of rest, day of wonder, day of peace. We offer thanks, O God, for the Shabbat which unites us in faith and hope together, for Shabbat holiness which inspires sacred living, for Shabbat memories flowing even in darkness, for Shabbat peace born of friendship and love. We offer thanks and blessings, O God. On page 11, Ki Eshmera Shabbat.
Oh
16. Sing praise to Adonai with the lyre and melodious song. With trumpets and the blast of the horn, raise a shout before Adonai the ruler. Let the sea and all within it thunder, the world and its inhabitants. Let the rivers clap their hands, the mountains sing joyously together at the presence of Adonai. For God is coming to rule the earth, God will rule the world justly and its peoples with integrity. Page 19. The voice of Adonai kindles flames of fire, the voice of Adonai convulses the wilderness. Adonai convulses the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of Adonai causes hinds to calve and strips forests bare, while in God's temple all say glory. Adonai sat enthroned at the flood, Adonai sits enthroned and sovereign forever. May Adonai grant strength to God's people, may Adonai bestow on God's people well-being. Adonai oz ve'amo yitain Adonai varech et amo v'shalom. Now if you'll turn to page 20 for just a moment, we're not going to sing with Adonai, we'll do Sholom Aleichem, but I just wanted to call your attention to the first verse, the first stanza of the Adonai, because it comes up in my sermon a little later. Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. If you look at the English translation, keep and remember a single command the only God caused us to hear, and so forth and so on. There are two versions of the Ten Commandments in the Torah, one in Exodus and one in Deuteronomy. They're virtually the same, but for a couple of small discrepancies or inconsistencies in the wording. And it's referred to here. One says, remember the Sabbath day. The other says, keep the Sabbath day. And the rabbis reconcile it by suggesting that God spoke both words at the same time. A unique feature that only God has to speak more than one word at the same time. Anyway, keep it in mind because it comes up again towards the end of my sermon this evening. Shalom Aleichem on page 24. Page Page 28, we stand for the Baruch.
Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach. The praise Adonai to whom praise is due forever. Praise be Adonai to whom praise is due now and forever.
Page 30. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who speaks the evening into being, skillfully opens the gates, thoughtfully alters the time and changes the seasons, and arranges the stars in their heavenly courses according to plan. You are creator of day and night, rolling light away from darkness and darkness from light, transforming day into night and distinguishing one from the other. Adonai Tzvaot is your name, ever-living God. May you reign continually over us into eternity. Blessed are you, Adonai, who brings on evening. Baruch atah Adonai, Hamari Aravim. The middle of 33, responsively. Wisdom and wonder, passion and instruction, story and symbol.
All these things your Torah gives to us.
And the more we devote ourselves to it, the more it grows and gives.
What could be truer token of your abiding love?
Then this holiest of your works, in the living language that gives it form. Baruch atah Adonai, Ohev Amo Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. Blessed is God's glorious majesty forever and ever. Page 38. All this we hold to be true and trustworthy for us. You alone are our God, and we are Israel, your people. You are our sovereign and Savior, who delivers us from oppressors' hands and saves us from tyrants' fists. You work wonders without number, marvels beyond count. You give us life and steady our footsteps. You performed miracles for us before Pharaoh, signs and wonders in the land of the Egyptians. You led your people Israel out from their midst to freedom for all time. When your children witnessed your dominance, they raised your name in gratitude and they accepted your sovereignty. Moses, Miriam, and all Israel sang to you together, lifting their voices joyously. Page 43. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Adonai, help us to walk with good companions, to live with hope in our hearts and eternity in our thoughts, that we may lie down in peace and rise up waiting to do your will. Baruch atah Adonai, Avarei Shalom Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Amo Yisrael, Ve'al Yerushalayim. Page 45. We are a people in whom the past endures, in whom the present is inconceivable without moments gone by. The Exodus lasted a moment enduring forever. What happened once upon a time happens all the time. We turn ahead to page 155. As we stand for the Amidah, we read silently pages 155 to the prayer for peace on page 164. Please stand. Grant us peace, your most precious gift, O eternal source of peace, and give us the will to proclaim this message to all the peoples of the earth. Bless our country as a safeguard of peace, its advocate among the nations. Make contentment reign within our borders, health and happiness within our homes. Strengthen the bonds of friendship and fellowship among all the inhabitants of our world. Plant virtue in every soul, and may the love of your name mellow every home and every heart. Praise you, Adonai, who blesses your people with peace. Baruch atah Adonai, mevarech et amo v'shalom Yisrael v'shalom. Turning ahead now to page 253, we also turn our thoughts to those who are healing, those who are hurt. We keep in our prayers ongoing good wishes for Kenny Elliott, April and Judy Foster, Maggie Moscato, and Debbie Weiner, and also included in our prayers this week in Grady Holly. Are there others whose names we'd like to keep in our thoughts?
Addison Lowry.
May the one who blessed our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bless and heal those who are ill. May the Blessed Holy One be filled with compassion for their health to be restored and their strength to be revived. May God swiftly send them a complete renewal of body and spirit, and let us say, Amen.
Say
working remotely, happened to mention Seth Rogen and his recent remarks about Israel. Troglodyte that I am, I asked, who is Seth Rogen? Whereupon he rolled his eyes in a way that said, "Oh, Dad, you're so out of touch. Don't you know anything?" So I Googled him. Seth Aaron Rogen is a Canadian actor, comedian, writer, producer, and director. Having begun as a stand-up comedian in Vancouver, he moved to Los Angeles for a part in Judge Apatow's series Freaks and Geeks, and then got a part on the sitcom Undeclared, which also hired him as a writer. He has an upcoming movie, An American Pickle, about a Jewish man who falls into a vat of pickle brine and is preserved. Upon awakening a century later, he is disturbed by how detached from Jewish tradition his grandson has become. Silly idea, but an intriguing premise. He was born April 15, 1982, making him 38 years old, attended a Jewish day school and summer camps, and has been married to a Jewish woman, Lauren Miller, since 2011. His TV shows include Freaks and Geeks, Preacher, Undeclared, and The League. And Jeffrey wonders why I've never heard of him. My dear friends, not only am I a cultural troglodyte, I'm also one of those people who has become routinely dismissive of most everything that a Hollywood celebrity has to say about almost anything, especially all things political, topical, or cultural. Most of these actors, in my opinion, are just overpaid, overprivileged entertainers with less education than you or I, who feel guilty about their immense wealth and therefore feel a need to be relevant and parade their social conscience. Whether it's their preachments at the Oscars, their virtue signaling at the Golden Globes, their hectoring us about the president, their hashtags and hypocrisy, they all knew about Harvey Weinstein, but said nothing so long as it furthered their careers. Or their lecturing to us from the confines of their gated and gilded residences. What do I really care what Meryl Streep and Leonardo DiCaprio have to say? Never mind some second-tier Johnny-come-lately like Seth Rogen. I do, however, make one exception to this rule. When it's a Jewish celebrity or someone speaking to Jewish matters, my ears perk up. I'll never again see another Mel Gibson movie. When Scarlett Johansson is pressured to step away as a spokesperson for SodaStream, an Israeli soft drink manufacturer, one of the most progressive companies in Israel, for doing business in the Palestinian territories, I pay attention. When Israeli-born actress Natalie Portman makes statements critical of Israel's nation-state law, I listen. And when Seth Rogen dismisses Israel as a silly idea, I check it out. And that is what this latest brouhaha is all about. Earlier this week, Rogen was interviewed by Mark Maron. For the record, I've never heard of him either. Maron, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, has a very popular podcast which is heard by millions of listeners. So that's one reason to pay attention. When a Jew makes negative statements about Israel which are heard by millions of others, the fact of being Jewish somehow gives those statements greater credibility. For lovers of Israel, that is a very worrisome fact of life, because Israel's detractors will seize on them. As it turns out, however, Maron, another supposed funny man, about the same age as Rogen and also Jewish, interviewed Rogen for nearly an hour on all things Jewish, and the two evidently enjoyed enormous rapport. But it was Rogen's Israel remarks, a relatively small part of the conversation, which have received most of the attention and raised most of the hackles. The usual and expected accusations of self-hating Jew have been the most frequent responses. But if one explores the interview in greater depth, it's clear that Rogen is anything but self-hating. He is very much a self-aware Jew and seemingly proud of it. On the subject of Israel, however, it's a somewhat different matter, and Rogen's thoughts are more than a little garbled and confused. David Harsanyi, a Jewish writer for National Review and the son of Hungarian Jews who fled Hungary in 1956, had some trenchant observations after the podcast. In a column entitled Why Seth Rogen's Anti-Israel Rant Matters, Harsanyi argues that he overlooks the reasons Israel was founded in the first place, and what makes it unique today. Further, that Rogan's views are riddled with factual errors and historical misconceptions and tainted by progressive ideology. So he writes in part, "You probably won't be surprised to learn that Seth Rogan has, at best, a facile understanding of basic history, faith, or politics. We shouldn't expect anything else. His job is to act. The problem, though, is that Rogan increasingly feels the need to share his illiterate opinions about serious issues with millions of people. This week, Rogan claimed he was, quote, fed a huge amount of lies about Israel growing up, and he now questions the legitimacy of the Jewish state's existence. To me," Rogan explains, "it just seems an antiquated thought process. If it's for religious reasons, I don't agree with it because I think religion is silly." And I interpolated here a little bit. Here I would point out that for generations of Jews, Jerusalem and a longing for a return to Zion has been a central tenet and hardly just a silly religious idea. But Rogan goes on, "If it is truly for the preservation of the Jewish people, it makes no sense because, again, you don't keep something you're trying to preserve all in one place, especially when that place is proven to be pretty volatile, you know? I'm trying to keep all these things safe. I'm going to put them in my blender and hope that that's the best place. That'll do it. Doesn't make sense to me. And I also think that as a Jewish person, I was fed a huge amount of lies about Israel my entire life. They never tell you that, oh, by the way, there were people there. They make it seem like it was just like sitting there like the effing doors open. They forget to include the fact to every young Jewish person." To which Harsanyi responds, "I was once a young Jewish person growing up in similar cultural circumstances to Rogan's, and anyone with basic cognitive abilities understood that other people lived in Israel. It was other people who launched pogroms against Jews in the 1920s and 30s. It was the other people who allied with Hitler during World War II, continuing to stoke violence against Jews, making the formation of a peaceful, multi-ethnic state impossible. It was the other people who rejected the United Nations partition plan and launched an all-out war against Jews only 3 years after the concentration camps were liberated. It was other people who fled and, with United Nations support, have continued to claim refugee status for themselves and their descendants, who initiated wave after wave of terrorism against Jewish civilians years before there were any occupied territories in the West Bank. It was other people who rejected dozens of peace offerings from 1948 onward, and yet some of those other people still reside in Israel and enjoy more liberal rights than Arabs do in any Arab nation. In fact, large numbers of those other people initially came to sparsely populated areas of Israel because of the influx of Jews who, starting in the late 19th century, brought economic growth and opportunities with them to this remote backwater of the Ottoman Empire. And I hate to break the news to Rogan, but the only people who lived in Jerusalem before Jews showed up were the Jebusites, and further, that Jews are the only ones who have maintained an uninterrupted presence in Jerusalem ever since. It's worth noting, too, that Israel is the only country about which politicians, intellectuals, journalists, and even actors feel the need to give an opinion on whether it should exist or not. You'll never hear a guest on a comedian's podcast inform the audience that they disagree with the existence of, say, Pakistan, a nation formed 1 year before Israel, and further, formed as a result of a partition plan and population transfer between the Muslims and Hindus of colonial India. You won't ever hear an actor grouse about how Pakistanis engaged in systematic genocidal murder and rape of hundreds of thousands of Bengalis who were already there, or how the Islamic dictatorship that runs the country now maltreats its minorities and women. Among contemporary progressives, this kind of a program is almost exclusively reserved for the tiny liberal Jewish state. It's a left-wing tradition. There are more than a dozen illiberal theocratic Islamic states in the world that leftists could get worked up about, but they almost never do. Then and now, all of this is propelled by an absurd notion that Westerners who hold power are, by Some unkind words are the worst kind of Jew hatred he'll ever encounter. Not everyone has been so lucky. Israel was the haven not only for those who escaped the Ukrainian Pale or the Holocaust, but for African Jews who were rescued from the communist-generated famines of Ethiopia, for hundreds of thousands of Middle Eastern Jews who, after centuries, were forced to flee the Islamic world after 1948, and for largely secular Soviet Jews in the 1970s and 80s who had often been imprisoned for speaking their minds. At one time or another, Jews had been abandoned and denied basic rights of citizenship by virtually every nation that ruled over them. Rogan contends Jews will be kept safe by spreading out. He ignores a central tenet of Judaism that always regarded dispersion of the Jews as a temporary exile awaiting a final redemption and eventual return to Zion. He may not know or is willfully ignorant of the fact that even as the oppression and massacre of Jews commenced, many places such as the United States, Britain, Switzerland, Spain, and British Palestine, rejected refugees who were fleeing the Nazis. Often these Jews had no place to go. Rogan finds this notion silly because it fails to comport with his superficial view of history. Not that Rogan's underlying contention is true anyway. He says that if Israel truly exists as a means of preserving the Jewish people, as if Zionism was invented in the 1800s just as a pretext for some tacit racism, you don't keep something you're trying to preserve all in one place, especially when that place is proven to be pretty volatile, you know? But if congregating in one place is a bad idea, why have countries at all? If the Indians and Chileans can't preserve Indian and Chilean traditions and values by congregating in one place, what's the use of borders? And if this is so, why do Palestinians need a state of their own? Why don't Palestinians just get into a blender to keep safe? Is Rogan even aware that whenever the Palestinians tried to climb out of the blender and settle elsewhere, they were rejected by their Arab brethren who prefer to keep them as pawns rather than absorb them? Rogan and Marone spend the entire podcast discussing Jewish culture in North America as if everyone can enjoy this luxury. Rogan seems to be under the impression that multi-ethnic and religious states are all like the United States or Canada, when in fact such arrangements are unique. But Rogan, who was surely taught that Judaism's ancient nature makes it both a nationality and faith, isn't attacking the status quo. He's attacking the one place in the Middle East that respects individual rights, gay rights, minority rights, and women's rights, and I assume the only country in the area that can openly play all of his movies. This kind of self-destructive instinct might be progressive, but it has nothing to do with being Jewish. David Harsanyi makes some arguably harsh, but in my opinion, mostly correct observations. So I checked some other websites to see how Rogan's remarks were being greeted. Reading the reactions in the Jerusalem Post, Times of Israel, and Haaretz, which is Israel's version of the New York Times, I was surprised that they were all fairly brief and low-key, even muted in their reporting. All agreed that the hour-long interview itself was a wide-ranging look at America's Jewish community and its issues, with Haaretz noting that critics had cherry-picked the conversation. Very affable and good-humored, close in age, both Rogan and Marone come from similar backgrounds and share similar attitudes. Haaretz described it as a typical Friday night dinner conversation in an Upper West Side New York City Jewish home. Marone himself declared it to be possibly the most Jewy conversation between Jewish celebrities ever broadcast, whereupon Rogan declared he was frightened by that, but mostly afraid of the Jews and how they would react. Rogan comes across as thoroughly unequivocally Jewish in a cultural sense, and even increasingly appreciative of certain religious aspects of Judaism, death and mourning practices, for example, though he otherwise dismisses the religious dimension as silly. He comments on his Jewish mother, how his father drilled into him an awareness of anti-Semitism, how his Jewish identity is hardwired in his DNA, how he's completely indifferent to having married a Jewish woman. I would have been totally happy marrying a non-Jewish person, Rogan revealed. It's only coincidental that his wife, Lauren Miller, is Jewish, and it really bothers her when I say that. She wants her Judaism to have some value to me, even though it doesn't in any way, shape, or form. Where all three media sources agree is that Rogan, and for that matter Maron too, is ambivalent about Israel. Haaretz seems to treat that as a positive thing, but to look at the readers' comments after their articles, most others do not. Some regard that ambivalence as rooted in ignorance. Others dismiss it as a reflection of his politics. Another criticizes Rogan for having bought into a false narrative about the origins of the Jewish state. Still others describe the entire matter as much ado about nothing. But one especially telling comment by Rogan, which seems to have escaped notice, was this. With regard to having this kind of a conversation publicly, it's scary, Rogan admitted, but we're Jews. We can say whatever we want. We should. I mean, if anyone can say whatever they effing want about this stuff, it should be two famous Jewish people. If anyone's getting rounded up first, it's our effing asses. Rounded up first. Why, whatever does he mean by that? My friends, when all is said and done and forgotten, the thing I found so worrisome and so disturbing about this interview was not Rogan's and Maron's shared ambivalence about Israel, nor even their woefully ignorant notions about Israel, but rather the fact that it is probably a far too accurate depiction of an entire generation and cohort of North American Jews. It is a kind of litmus test, indicating just how wide is the divide between us and them, between North American Jews and our Israeli cousins. And it is growing. Warner Ferretier confirmed this to me a few years ago when he was studying in Israel as a rabbinical student with the conservative movement. He told me how hostile many of his classmates, future conservative rabbis, were towards Israel. And my recently college-graduating son confirmed the same to me this week about his own contemporaries. Sound the alarms. Or maybe it's just something we have to learn to live with. A religious, spiritual, political, existential, and generational Jewish divide rooted in different views, values, and experiences. This week's Torah reading is Ve'et Hanan, in which a second version of the Ten Commandments is presented, one which differs slightly in its wording from the first version in Exodus. One instructs us to remember the Sabbath day, while the other one tells us to keep the Sabbath day. One sage has commented, one would expect a perfect replica of the first set, an exact repetition as Moses and God both promise. It is startling and wonderful to see that the texts are not identical. Traditional commentary, encoded in Lecha Dodi, tells us that both versions of the commandment to observe the Shabbat are uttered in the same instant by God. The single divine word shatters into countless sparks, as when a hammer strikes the anvil. So it is that the Torah pushes back against the notion that there could ever be a singular version of divine truth, or that one generation's truth would always be exactly the same as the previous generations. Divine truth is always beyond human grasp. The pure light of the divine is necessarily refracted by human experience into countless colors. The Jewish world of today is characterized by countless sparks. We can resist it, we can rue it, we can regret it, or we can recognize it, taking a page from the ad campaign of a well-known fashion house, celebrate the united colors. So let us celebrate. King Yiratson may be God's will, and together we say, Amen. Returning to our prayer books, pages 4 and 5 for the Kiddush. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzah b'anu, v'shabbat kadsho v'ahavah v'ratzah yichilanu, zikaron l'maaseh v'reishit, ki hu yom tehillah l'mikrai kodesh, zecher l'tziat mitzrayim, ki vanu v'charta, v'tanu kidashka, mikol ha'amim, v'shabbat kadshaka, ya'avahu v'ratzon, yichaltanu, Baruch atah Adonai, Mekadesh HaShabbat. L'chaim.
Okay.
Page 283, we stand for the audit.
Let us adore the ever-living God and render praise unto you, who spreads out the heavens and established the earth, whose glory is revealed in the heavens above, and whose greatness is manifest throughout the world. You are our God, there is none else. Manachnu korim, u'nishtachvim u'vodim, u'lifnei melech, molech hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'nemar, V'haya Adonai, L'melech al kol haaretz, V'yom ha'chu, Yeh Adonai echad, U'shemo, U'shemo, U'shemo
Please be seated. Our thoughts turn to those who have departed this earth, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every race and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death. Please choose from among the various meditations beginning on page 288 and make one of them your own. We think of our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died of the season in years past, and those whom we've drawn into our hearts with our own. As the name of your loved one is called out, you're invited to stand if you so wish. And when all names have been read out, we'll stand together for Kaddish. Although her name has not been added yet to the yard site list, our sympathies especially go out to the Arjun family on the passing of Beryl. You'll be notified sometime during the week of the time and date of the final arrangements will be graveside next Friday. We also recall the names of Frida Smith, Yenna Morantz, Tofik Arjman, Thomas Brunner, Zachary Lowenstein, Eugene Oden, Louis Wald, Boris Brodsky, and Daniel Carlin, taken from us over the course of the past year. And from across the years, we recall the names of Paula Bank, Sarah Barak Bartov, Dr. David E. Barker, Richard N. Benson, Alexander Brown, Louis A. Deutsch, Ethel Silver Gingold, Louisa Hammerslough, Leo A. Helfont, Miriam Josephson, Miriam K. Katz, Janet Kellner, Elise Lawrence, Andrew Meyerstein, Bonnie Mitchell, Saul A. Salzenstein, Esther Schwartz, Rachel Wagner, Charles K. Warzar, Dorothy Wolfson, and Hannah Worms, the yard side of whose passing takes place at this season of the year. Zicharnam L'Bracha, many of the memories be for blessing. As together we now stand for Mourner's Cottage on page 294. Yikidal v'yikidal shmei rabah, b'olma divrach yurtei v'yom malchutei, b'chaye chon v'yomei chon, b'chaye dechol b'Yisrael, b'agala v'zman kavi v'mir amein. Yehei shmei rabah v'barach v'elam olmei omaya, yidvarach v'yishtabach v'yipa'ar v'yitramah v'yitnaseh, v'yihadar v'yid'aleh v'yid'alal shmei v'kudishah v'yihu, Elam min kol birchata b'shirata, tushvichata v'nechemata da'amiran v'olama v'mru amen. Yehei shalom al-rab v'michamaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al Yisrael v'mru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromam, v'yaseh shalom aleinu v'al Yisrael v'mru amen.
Amen.
May the source of peace and peace to those who mourn and comfort to all who are bereaved among us. Together we say, please be seated. Really not too much on the calendar. I mean, it never is even at this time of the year, even without COVID. But services, family service next Friday evening at 5:30. And then various assortment of meetings and Zoom seminars and whatnot. Our closing song with all due and deliberate thanks to our keyboard maestro. What's the female for maestro? Okay. Nicole Del Giorno. Closing song on page 322, Ein Keloheinu.
Shabbat Shalom.